Hello, my name is Lucas. I'm 26, and I live with my mother in one of those old neighborhoods in Salvador, where the houses have more stories than paint, and time seems to trickle slowly across the cracked sidewalks. I'm not an electrician or a plumber, but I end up being a little bit of everything. I'm the neighbor you call when the faucet won't stop dripping or a light bulb flickers one too many times. That's how I started going over to Clara Medeiros' house. First, it was a gate hinge that kept sticking, then a light switch in the hallway. And now, on that stuffy March afternoon, I was there to fix a gutter that had come loose in the last heavy storm. And in Salvador, you know, when it rains with a soul of its own. Clara lives 2 houses down from mine. Hers is the prettiest on the street, even with the paint a little faded. She has a garden so well tended, it seems the flowers queue up to be born there. Pink bougainvillea blossoms spill over the wall, and the jasmine perfumes the sidewalk, even in the midday heat. I always found that curious, how something could smell like a beginning in a place so old. She takes care of it all herself. At 59, Clara is one of those women who move slowly, but with a firmness, as if she still carries a great deal within her. I heard from my mother that she lost her husband about 8 years ago. No children, no nieces or nephews who come to visit. Just her, the flowers, and the silence. That afternoon, the sky was covered in dense clouds, and the air itself felt heavy. I walked over slowly, a screwdriver in my pocket, and my thoughts somewhere far away. When I knocked, I heard her voice from inside. "You can come in, Lucas. It's open." She always received me like that, with the door ajar, as if not expecting company, but not preventing it either. I stepped inside and was immediately met by the unmistakable scent of her house, a mix of old wood, lavender incense, and freshly baked cornbread, even when there was no cake. Clara was in the kitchen, wearing a light blue dress with small flowers embroidered along the hem. She stood stirring a glass of passion fruit juice with ice and looked at me with that smile that didn't show teeth, but held a quiet presence. "Did you bring the sun with you?" she teased, glancing at the gray sky through the window. I smiled back. "I brought a screwdriver. Will that do?" She gave a soft laugh and handed me the glass. "Drink. It's cold." I accepted. Not so much for the thirst, but for the excuse to remain there in that suspended moment. We sat at the kitchen table, the one with the plastic tablecloth and a small pot of basil in the center. For a few seconds, we said nothing. Only the sound of ice crackling in the glass filled the air. "You know, Lucas," she said suddenly, her eyes fixed on the window, "some days, I don't even remember what it's like to miss someone." The sentence landed in the kitchen like a breeze before a storm. Gentle, but heavy with what was to come. I looked at her, but didn't speak right away. I was afraid of breaking the moment. Clara didn't say it with sadness or as a plea for pity. She said it like someone who had just realized something in the middle of a sip. "You feel lonely," I stated more than asked. She shrugged, still looking outside. "It's not quite that." She paused, then turned her gaze back to me. "It's that when loneliness lasts too long, you start to forget it exists. And then one day, you realize you've also forgotten how to feel. You forget what it's like to be felt." I was silent, not from a lack of words, but from an excess of feeling. I realized then that she wasn't talking about physical presence. She was talking about something deeper, about being seen, about being remembered. I only said, I think of you, even when you don't call. She turned her head slowly. Her eyes met mine like someone searching for something long lost. It wasn't shock or emotion, it was recognition, as if someone had finally flipped a switch in a room that had been dark for years. She looked away and stood up. I'll get some napkins, she said, though we didn't need any. I sat there, looking at the glass of juice. The ice was melting slowly, like everything in that house, like everything in her. When she returned, she sat down again, quieter now. Sometimes, Lucas, too much kindness can be frightening. When you spend so much time alone, any affection feels dangerous. I took a deep breath. I understood, because deep down, we are all afraid of being broken again, even when it's a touch that might mend us. But not all affection comes to hurt, I said. Sometimes, it's just there to remind you that you're still here. She didn't answer, but her eyes shone, not with tears, but with memory. In that moment, she was no longer Mrs. Clara. She was Clara, a woman who had once danced the bolero in her living room, who had letters tucked away in a drawer, who had waited for phone calls that never came. A woman who was now here, in front of me, her hands resting on the plastic tablecloth, trying to remember what it was like to be seen and to be touched without fear. The afternoon slowly darkened. Outside, the sky threatened to break, but the rain held back. We stayed there a while longer, talking about small things. The cat that had appeared in her yard, the plants that didn't like direct sun. But in every simple word, there was something larger, something forming in the space between us. Before I left, I went to the gutter and fixed the problem in a few minutes. But I walked back to the kitchen slowly. She was still there, waiting for me with another glass of juice. It's all set now, I told her. Well, now I'll have to invent another excuse to call you. I smiled. You don't need an excuse. She held my gaze for a moment that lasted longer than it should have. And when she finally looked away, I understood that her words weren't just about the gutter. They were about something more, something she herself was still trying to name. I left with the feeling that something had shifted, not in the world, but in us. Small, imperceptible, like the first autumn leaf that falls without anyone seeing it. But it's there, the change. And for the first time in a long time, as I walked back home, I wasn't thinking about how I had helped someone. I was thinking about how, maybe, she had helped me too. I went back to Clara's 2 days later, not for any urgent repair, but because the silence of her kitchen still echoed in me. That thick silence, filled with invisible presences. My mother had asked me to take over some mangoes that Mrs. Lords had left at our gate. I used it as an excuse. When I knocked, Clara was already there, as if she knew I was coming. Come in, Lucas, she said, her voice even. I entered, carrying the bag of fruit, and smelled it again. That scent of her house, of passion fruit, and things made old by time. Clara was standing in the garden, tending to her potted plants. I brought some mangoes. They're ripe, I said, trying to sound casual. She turned with a brief smile. Thank you. It's hard to find good fruit around here anymore. The ones from the market taste of nothing. We stood there, side by side among the plants. The sun peeked through the clouds, filtered by the tall leaves. She was wearing a light-colored dress, the same one as the other day, perhaps, or one very much like it. The wind made the hem dance, as if it too were listening to some old song. It was in that instant I realized Clara was not just a 59-year-old woman with a pretty garden and a house full of memories. She was a woman with a history, with warmth, with a body that had once danced, that had once been held with tenderness and desire. I felt foolish for not having seen it before. She bent down to trim a leaf, and as she straightened up, she gave me that look of hers, half weary, half curious. Is everything all right, Lucas? It took me a second to answer. Yes, I said, hesitating. But what if I said I think of you even when you're not calling about a repair? She froze, just for a moment. Her gaze didn't land on me. It settled on some random point down the street, perhaps to shield herself from the answer she didn't want to give, or the one she wanted to give, but couldn't. You're very kind, Lucas, she said quietly. It isn't kindness, it's the truth. Clara smiled, but not with her mouth. It was a smile in her eyes, the kind that doesn't want to be seen. Then she turned and went back into the kitchen. I followed, feeling I had said too much, or perhaps not nearly enough. It rained that night, one of those classic Salvador rains, thick and heavy, almost slow. The gutters rattled against the wall, and the roof seemed to breathe with every drop. I went over later than usual. Clara had called, saying the lock on the laundry room cupboard was stuck. I knew it wasn't urgent, but I went, and she knew I would. This time, the house was darker, just a single light on in the kitchen, casting golden reflections on the wooden table. Have you had coffee? She asked. I have, but I'll have another. She poured 2 cups of fresh brewed coffee, the aroma filling the room. We sat. The rain outside seemed to isolate us from the world, to create a cocoon. We were silent for a time, stirring our sugar slowly. Then Clara spoke, her voice as low as the sound of rain on the window pane. It's been a long time since anyone has touched me, Lucas. I lifted my eyes. She wasn't looking at me. She was looking into the empty space, as if listening to her own words. I mean, it's not just physical. It's not about sex. It's something else. It's the touch that matters. The one that says, I see you, I feel you. I understand. I nodded. Not automatically, but because I truly did. That absence of a touch that acknowledges, that validates. Sometimes, not even a hand on the arm, not a firm hug, not a hand on the waist by chance. Nothing. Clara traced the rim of her cup with her finger, as if sketching a memory. And the worst part, Lucas, is that I didn't even notice when I started to miss it. By the time I realized, it didn't hurt anymore. It was just empty, like an outstretched hand that never finds another. My throat tightened. I wanted to say something, but something more than words was needed. I reached my hand out, placing it on the table near hers. I didn't touch her. I just left it there. A small but deliberate gesture, a presence within reach. She noticed. Her eyes lowered to my hand. She didn't move. She didn't pull back, but she didn't move forward either. She just looked, as if recognizing something she once had. You're too young to understand this kind of silence, she murmured. Age doesn't stop anyone from feeling, I replied. The rain grew heavier. The sound of the world outside seemed to dissolve, as if everything that existed was right here, in this kitchen, between our hands, almost touching, between our held breaths. I stood slowly, went to the sink, and washed my cup with slow movements. Not because it needed washing, but because her presence deserved time. Clara remained seated, her eyes fixed on the tablecloth. "Sometimes I'm afraid of wanting it again," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "Of wanting presence, affection, of desiring to be desired." I turned to face her. Being afraid of wanting something doesn't make the wanting go away. She nodded, a minuscule gesture, but in it there was a kind of courage, the kind that grows slowly after being buried for years under routine, under silence. I moved closer. I stood beside the table. She tilted her head up to look at me. There were no tears, no drama, just a veiled invitation, a space opening up. I didn't touch her, but I stayed there, and in that moment, I realized that my presence was what she needed. Not the gesture, not the advance, but the simple fact of someone remaining, of someone staying without running from the absence, without running from the fear. Clara exhaled slowly, as if releasing a part of her past with that breath. "Thank you," she said, looking at nothing in particular, but speaking directly to me. "For what?" "For reminding me that my hands can still be reached for." When I left, the downpour had softened to a drizzle. The Salvador sky was weeping gently, as if it too didn't want to interrupt what we had shared. I walked home in silence, my steps light on the wet pavement. I didn't know exactly what any of it meant, but I knew that a space had opened that night, and inside it were two hands that had not yet touched, but were reaching for each other. I didn't go home that night. It wasn't planned. There was no explicit invitation, no veiled promises. We simply stayed. Time slipped by slowly between quiet words, long silences, and the rhythmic sound of the rain outside. And before I knew it, the night had fallen completely. Clara offered me more passion fruit juice. The glass was still cool, beaded with condensation. The soft, yellow light of the kitchen gave her skin a glow that seemed made of memory. We would look at each other now and then, but without any urgency. It was as if we were learning how to be together, without the need to fill every minute with words. She stirred the liquid in her glass slowly, staring into it as if searching for something at the bottom. Courage, perhaps, or lost time. "Did I ever tell you I was a teacher?" she asked suddenly. I shook my head, curious. "Literature. For over 20 years, I taught teenagers who thought Drummond was a brand of medicine." I let out a low chuckle. She smiled too, but there was a certain nostalgia tangled in it. "I loved what I did, you know? It was like blowing on cold embers. Sometimes it worked, sometimes it didn't, but it was always worth the try." We fell silent. Then she continued, almost as if talking to herself. "There was a time when I used to dance the bolero, Saturday nights, at the neighborhood club. A satin dress, low heels, my hair pinned up. I felt alive. Eyes followed me, hands sought me, and I let them." She paused for a long time. The sound of the rain intensified, as if the world itself had decided to listen. After I married, I stopped dancing. Then I stopped teaching. Then I stopped being seen. Clara looked at me, not with sadness, but with a stark clarity. And the strangest part, Lucas, is that I never realized it hurt until today. I leaned forward slightly, resting my arms on the table. That part of you is still alive, I said with conviction. She furrowed her brow, as if she wanted to believe me, but didn't know how. It lives. I touched my own chest. Here, in the way you stir your cup, in the care you give your plants, in your voice when you speak of poetry. She watched me for several long seconds. Her eyes shimmered, but she didn't cry. It was as if, for the first time in a long time, she was being touched on the inside, in a place no one else had reached. I don't know how to be that woman anymore, she said in a whisper. Maybe she's dead. No. She was only silenced, I replied, but she's still breathing. Clara lowered her gaze, her fingers interlaced on the table. And there, in that simple kitchen, under the warm light, surrounded by the scent of old coffee and rain, something was born. It had no name, no hurry. It was simply born. It was already dawn when she stood up to get a blanket. We had moved to the living room, now sitting on the old sofa with its crocheted cushions. The only light came from the lamp in the corner, and the sound of the rain had become a silent, musical backdrop. If you want to get some sleep, you can stay right there, she said, handing me the blanket. I'm not sleepy, I answered. And it was true. Clara sat on the other end of the sofa, pulling her own blanket over her legs. We sat in silence for several minutes. Sometimes, silence is the only possible language between two people who are still learning to name what they feel. She turned her head slowly and said, My husband never looked at me the way you do. I hadn't expected that. My heart beat a little faster, but I remained still. Not even in the early years. Not even on the good nights. He saw me, yes, but the way you see a pretty plant in the living room. A decorative presence, but not essential. She took a deep breath. Your gaze frightens me, Lucas. Why? Is it because you see me? I took a moment to answer. There was so much weight in that question, and so much truth. I don't see what you were, or what you lost. I see what you still are, Clara. She closed her eyes for a moment. When she opened them, they were moist, but steady. I'm afraid of what this might awaken in me, she confessed. Afraid of waking up parts of me that have fallen silent. Maybe it's time for them to wake up, I answered, even if it's slowly. She rested her head on the cushion, facing me. The distance between us was small. We could have reached out and touched, but we didn't. Not yet. You see me, Lucas? It's beautiful. A pause. And terrifying. I'm scared too, Clara admitted, but sometimes fear is just the body reminding itself that it's alive. We stayed there, two bodies close, two distinct worlds, two souls pierced by the same thing, a gaze that disarms. There was no kiss, no touch, but everything changed. Because when two people see each other like that, without filters, without defenses, the world around them is transformed as well. She pulled the blanket up to her shoulders. I drew back slightly, giving her space, but not distance. And for the first time since I'd entered that house, I realized the silence wasn't empty. It was waiting. It was fertile soil. We fell asleep right there, on opposite ends of the sofa, lulled by the rain. by the things unsaid, and by whatever it was we didn't yet know how to name, but knew had begun. 4, maybe 3 days later, I received a short message on my phone. Lucas, the hallway light started flickering again. Could you maybe stop by today? I didn't need to ask if it was true. I knew the light bulb wasn't the reason, and she knew that I knew. But I accepted the disguised invitation as if it were real. Sometimes, tenderness comes disguised as an excuse. Late that afternoon, I knocked on her door. Clara opened it with that same discreet smile. But this time, there was something different in her eyes, as if she were trying to hold a wall steady. But the cracks were already showing. Come in, she said, stepping aside. The light keeps flickering. Sometimes it goes out, sometimes it comes back on. I nodded, looking up, but the hallway was perfectly lit. Clara noticed my gaze and gave a sheepish smile. It seems to have fixed itself today. Typical. Or maybe it just wanted some attention, I replied, raising an eyebrow. She let out a soft laugh. We stood there in the hallway for a few seconds. She leaned against the wall, crossing her arms, as if trying to maintain control over what she was feeling. It's strange, she said suddenly, having someone around again. A good strange? I asked. She hesitated. A dangerous strange. Because when you spend too long without affection, without touch, without being seen, tenderness can hurt sometimes. I moved a little closer, not enough to touch her, just enough for her to feel my presence. You don't have to do anything, I said in a low voice. Just feel. She closed her eyes for an instant, as if testing her own body, her own heart, to see if they still knew how to recognize something so simple. Then she opened them and looked directly into mine. Feeling is what scares me most, Lucas. Feeling is what saves us most, Clara. We stood like that, two bodies in a hallway with too much light and too few words. And between us, the tenderness she said could hurt was beginning to heal. We went into the living room. Clara brought coffee. I sat on the sofa. She settled into the armchair beside it. Between us, on the small table, was an old photograph in a dark wood frame. My eyes landed on it naturally. It was her, younger, maybe in her early 30s. She was smiling with a light in her eyes that was still recognizable after so many years. Beside her stood a tall, serious-looking man. Your husband? That was our civil wedding, Clara said, noticing my gaze. There was no party, just family, a simple cake, and a bottle of cheap wine. She picked up the frame, turning it slightly in her hand. I loved him, she said, but not in the way I wanted to be loved. I stayed quiet. The best answers sometimes are silence. He was a good man, she continued. Hardworking, polite. He never disrespected me, but he never saw beyond the obvious. He never wanted to know what lit me up inside. He never cared about what made me truly laugh, or about the books I cried over while reading alone in our room. She sighed, and years of life were held in that breath. Sometimes I wondered if I was being ungrateful, but today I realize that loving isn't just about taking care of someone, it's about wanting to see them whole, even the parts no one else sees. She placed the photograph back on the table and looked at me. There was a delicacy about her, but also a new courage, as if telling me this was like opening an old window and letting the air rush in. You see me, Lucas. You have from the beginning. It disarms me. I rose slowly from the sofa and went to her. I knelt beside the armchair, my movements slow, respectful, as if each one had to ask permission from time itself. She didn't pull away. I reached out my hand and, for the first time, touched hers. It was a simple touch, my palm gently covering her fingers, but in that gesture lived everything that years of absence had failed to erase: the desire to be reached. Clara looked at our hands for a moment, then lifted her eyes to mine. "I thought I'd forgotten what this felt like," she whispered. "This?" I asked, being touched with intention, but without hurry. We stayed like that, she seated, me kneeling, our hands joined by a touch that asked for nothing more than presence. It wasn't romantic, it wasn't sexual, it was human. And when I let go of her hand, I did it carefully, as if returning something precious that had been entrusted to me for a few moments. We looked at each other for another moment, and there was a mutual recognition there, as if somehow we had crossed an invisible frontier, not of bodies, but of souls. That night, when I left her house, the world seemed the same, but inside me, nothing was. The rain had returned, but this time it was silent, as if the sky knew that a storm was already brewing within. Clara called around 6 in the evening. She didn't ask for anything, just wondered if I wanted to come over for coffee. I said yes. In truth, I think I would have said yes, even if she had just asked me to come over and listen to the silence with her. When I arrived, the house was quiet. The kitchen light filtered warmly through the floral curtains. Clara was waiting for me with an expression that was neither sad nor happy. It was something in between, a space between places. "Hi," she said, with that small smile that made me want to stay. "Hi," I returned. We drank our coffee, exchanging few words, and afterward, we just sat there at the table, time passing slowly, as if it were too lazy to move on. That's when she spoke. "I'm afraid of becoming soft again, Lucas." I looked at her, not understanding at first. Soft like this, vulnerable, the kind that opens up to feel, to be touched, to hope for something. She lowered her eyes, her fingers interlaced on the tablecloth. "I've spent so long keeping myself firm, closed off, and now, this touch, this affection, it frightens me, because if I let myself feel, I might break again." The confession didn't come with drama, it came with truth. Clara didn't want pity, she wanted to be understood. I slowly reached my hand across the table until it found hers. I laced my fingers through hers, and there, under the yellow kitchen light, with shadows dancing on the walls, I said, "Softness can break you, yes, but it also heals." She looked at me, her eyes slightly moist, but no tears fell. There was strength in her fragility. There was presence. "You speak as if you're older than I am," she murmured. I smiled. "Maybe I am, or maybe I've just learned to value what time teaches us, that being hard protects you, but it also stops the warmth from getting in." The silence that followed wasn't uncomfortable. It was one of acceptance. She didn't pull her hand away, nor did she squeeze mine. She just let it rest there, and that said everything. That night, her fear didn't disappear, but it made room for hope. Later, on the living room sofa, Clara pulled a blanket over herself. She sat with her bare feet tucked under her body wrapped in a simple nightgown. I sat beside her, respecting her space. The TV was on, but the volume was low, a gentle hum to fill the silences, even though they no longer needed hiding. "Are you leaving tonight?" she asked, without looking at me. "Do you want me to stay?" She thought for a second, then nodded, saying nothing. I understood. She leaned against me slowly, like someone testing the water before getting in. The weight of her body against my shoulder was light, yet it was full of history. So many sleepless nights, so many voids left by time and absence. I pulled the blanket over both of us. Clara shifted, letting her head rest on my chest. My arm slid behind her, holding her with care, with respect, with tenderness. We said nothing. The silence was complete, but it was full. Her breathing grew slow, deep, and mine followed. Our bodies in sync, without hurry, without promises. Before she closed her eyes, she murmured, "I don't know what this is." I answered in a low voice, almost a whisper, "We don't have to name it." She said nothing more. She just gently squeezed my hand, which was resting on her waist. There, in that simple room, on a sofa worn by time, we slept together for the first time. Not as lovers, not as neighbors, but as two people who had found in each other a safe place, a shelter. And for the first time in a very long time, sleep came without resistance. Because in that simple gesture, a head on a shoulder, interlaced fingers, a shared silence, was everything that words could never hope to reach. The sun crept timidly through the cracks in the curtains, streaking the room with golden lines. The world outside seemed to have no idea what had happened in here during the night, as if the day was proceeding as usual, while two bodies had learned how to rest in one another. Clara was still asleep against me, her head tilted slightly on my shoulder, her hair disheveled, as if time had only passed over her. My hand rested on hers, and for an instant, I thought that if I moved, all of this would disappear, like a dream you can't recapture. But it wasn't a dream. It was real, soft, simple, and strangely light. She stirred slowly, waking as if not to startle the silence. When she opened her eyes, she looked at me for a long moment without saying anything, just existing there, present. Then she whispered, "When you touched me, it wasn't about skin." "No?" I asked, meeting her gaze. "No. It was about remembering that I exist." That sentence fell between us like a ray of light. Clara didn't say it to be seductive or dramatic. She said it with the quiet certainty of someone who recognizes the weight of her own invisibility and the delicate relief of being seen again. "The world forgot to look," I replied. "I didn't." She smiled, a full smile this time, not hidden, not measured, a smile of someone who accepts being found. We got up slowly. Clara went to the kitchen to make coffee, and I followed her, unhurried. The smell of the brewing grounds mingled with the scent of the flowers from her garden. Everything felt more vivid, sharper. We sat at the table just as we had done so many times before, but now something had changed. The space between us was no longer filled with doubt, but with something more serene, a kind of shared peace. "Are you leaving early?" she asked. It's better. I have to help my mother with a few things. Clara nodded in a way that said she understood, even if she didn't want to. We finished our coffee in silence. Afterwards, she walked me to the door. The sky was clear, the street still sleepy. Birds cut through the air between the power lines, and the plants in the garden swayed in the late dawn breeze. Standing before the gate, she looked at me with an expression that was both light and heavy at the same time. "Can I call you?" she asked, almost like a child asking for permission to dream again. "You don't need an excuse," I replied with a half smile. "I'll be here." She lowered her eyes for a moment. Then she lifted her face and simply said, "Thank you." I didn't ask why. I knew the answer, and she knew that I knew. I turned to leave. My steps were slow, my body light. Behind me, Clara was still there by the gate, her hands resting on the iron, her face touched by the rising sun. There was no hug, no promise, but there was something more solid between us, a mutual recognition. As I walked back along the dew-kissed sidewalk, I felt the gentle warmth of the morning on my shoulders, the same warmth that, just days before, had felt stifling, trapped between old walls. Now, it was different. It was new. The windows of the houses were beginning to open. The sound of the city was slowly returning. Voices, horns in the distance, hurried footsteps, but none of it pierced through to me. Inside, everything was still silent. A good, fulfilling silence. I thought of Clara, of that woman who had forgotten how to be seen, of the woman who, despite her fear, had let me in. And I realized that spring doesn't always arrive with flowers, but with a look, a touch, with the possibility of starting over from within. Spring still exists, even for those who thought it didn't, even for those who hid for years under dry leaves, even for those who thought tenderness was far too dangerous. It's there, silent, sprouting in the cracks between a warm coffee, an unhurried touch, and the courage to be soft again. Thank you so much for joining me on this journey. If this story resonated with you, if at any point you felt seen, remembered, or simply held in the silence, then it was all worthwhile. Here at Forbidden Tales, we believe that love, desire, loneliness, and tenderness are all part of the same breath. If you'd like more stories like this, real, intimate, forbiddingly human, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. There is so much more life between the lines than we can imagine. And who knows, maybe the next story will be about you.